The reason why I decided to retell this story is because I've always been fascinated by myths and folklore. Always been fascinated by stories that have stuck in our collective imagination and that people have told over and over again. Like most of the world, I grew up very familiar with Western myths and folktales, so whether it's the Greek myths, epics like the Odyssey, or Grimm's fairy tales, I grew up and these stories were very much ingrained in my childhood. But being half French and half Thai and growing up in Thailand, I also grew up with another set of stories, a whole other canon of folklore to draw from that isn't really known outside of Thailand. I chose to do a retelling of the Thai Ramakien because it is one of the most important and instantly recognizable stories in Thai canon. A story that in itself is actually a retelling of the Indian Ramayana. Everywhere you go in Thailand, you will see references to this story. And in the Thai version of the story, the character of Hanuman has a much bigger role to play. Though not the official hero of the story, I guess you could say he's the hero of the story in Thai people's hearts. He's definitely a favorite of mine, but as with most myths, the stories are always told from the point of view of big important men. There are so many women in the Ramakien, but they just seem to kind of come and go as the plot needs to further the story along. I wanted to do a retelling from a different perspective. I'm actually still writing a novel-length version of this story, but writing this short story really helped me find the main beats and the main plot points of the story. If I'm completely honest, it wasn't until adulthood that I decided to deepen my knowledge on these familiar stories. I wanted to reconnect with my roots, but also share them with a wider audience. I want people to love these stories as much as I do, and I wanted to be able to share something of my culture. A culture that is equally as fascinating and has just as much to offer as the Western canon.
This is a good question. I wanted to retell a fairy tale story that wasn't one that was done, like, overdone. There's been a lot of the same ones I find repeated over and over, and I wanted it to be a little bit more original and creative, finding a story that kind of fell by the wayside. Probably didn't do so well because I picked The Little Mermaid, and I think that's still a very popular choice. However, so I had an idea at the back in the back of my mind about a version of The Little Mermaid from the original tale that I thought once I saw this contest, this would have been a very good time to at least explore that avenue and see if that story has any merit or worth, I should say.
I'm gonna have to say it was kind of that cliched thing of that's where the inspiration took me. I was looking through a lot of books, looking through the internet for sort of obscure and interesting bits of folklore that caught my attention, and the legend of Black Annis was the one that kind of always stuck with me. It was always sort of on just under the surface of my mind, and that was the one where a sort of cohesive story seemed to be easiest to put together. And also, so the legend of Black Annis is from Leicester, which is fairly close to where I grew up. I've got family who live there. And even though I didn't actually find out about the legend until a fair few years after I left that area, I was kind of fascinated by how much folklore there is sort of all over the UK, sort of in the places you know. If I live in Oxford now, there's a lot of local folklore, and I quite like just connecting folklore to actual places that you can see, especially if those legends are close to being forgotten, which a lot of local folklore is these days. So apart from Black Annis being the one story that really jumped out at me, I Yeah, I really wanted to retell a story that was close to a real place, and that might cause someone to sort of look at the area around them and look into what are the legends there, and just look into how many really amazing stories there are all over the UK.
So the reason I decided to retell this story is because it comes from the Isle of Man, which is a small island in the middle of the Irish Sea and is very special to me. It's where I spent all of my childhood holidays, because it's where my dad grew up and where my grandparents lived until they passed away. So I heard a lot of these traditional Manx fairy tales growing up, and they always absolutely fascinated me. I think partly due to the fact you can really feel the magic on the island, and there is a sense that everybody still believes in it that little bit there, which obviously as a child just really brings it to life that little bit more. So I kind of wanted to bring some of that to the rest of the world, really, and so they could enjoy it as much as I did.
So I decided to retell the Faerie Midwife because I've always been fascinated by more traditional fairy folklore, where they're not your friends, like we're so used to seeing them in modern stories and media. And I thought this was a great tale, like a great example of that moral ambiguity and just how well their stories translate into the modern world as well, that they still fit in. It's just, still something that could plausibly happen. As far as the Skogsra, I'm so sorry if I butchered that. This wasn't a specific tale that I decided to retell. It was more of a character study, weaving together the different threads and trends that you see in the classic folk tale around them, and kind of seeing how they would fit in and interact with the modern world versus the classical world that we're so used to seeing them in.
When I was a kid, one of my favourite films was Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And the first words that Slugworth says to Charlie, "Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting for fear of little men," always really stuck with me. And when I was older, probably a teenager, and started watching horror films, picked one up called Don't Go Into the Basement, and there's an old lady who says the same words there as well. So after doing a bit of research and finding the poem that originally came from, that was a poem that always just kind of stayed in the back of my mind. And when the question was set, when we had to choose a story to retell, a folktale to retell, I kind of wanted to think outside the box a little bit. So I decided to choose that one because for one, because of the films that I'd seen it in, I was aware that it was somewhere in the collective imagination, in the collective consciousness, and it was one that when I was looking at it, when I was reading it out, I thought it lent itself very well to a narrative tale. So that was why I decided to choose that one, and it was a nice little challenge as well, converting a poem into a story. So that was why I picked that one.
I've always quite liked myths which involve shapeshifters in one way or another, and Selkies were one of those mythological creatures where there didn't seem to be very many stories out there about them. So I thought they'd be quite a fun starting point to write about.
My story is from the dark side, Rumpelstiltskin, and it is from Rumpelstiltskin's perspective. So the fun part is that you get to see the villain's point of view instead of the typical hero's point of view. And I decided to retell this one because it's a different look at maybe why Rumpelstiltskin did the things that he did. And I just find that to be an interesting topic, and I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I did writing it.
I, at the time, was looking for something to help stimulate my creative mindset. I'm a very passionate person when it comes to creativity, arts, craft, writing, I love it all. And this time around I wanted to do something with creativity in terms of creative writing. I am very passionate about it, as in particular I prefer to write about fantasy and sci-fi and fiction in general. So this time around that's what I decided to do, and I came across this story and I felt like this helped me to delve into my creative side, and that's why I was able to retell this story.
So I chose to retell the story of Snow White and Rose Red for this collection because that's a fairy tale that has sort of stuck with me for my entire life. I have these really vivid memories of reading that story as a little girl. It was part of a book of fairy tales that I had that was adapted for kids, I believe. And as a little girl reading stories, I had gotten used to the format of maybe there was one damsel in distress character, or maybe there was one female character that was a warrior or something like that, and that would be it for the whole story. There might be only one female character, and I didn't always identify with that character as I was reading, and that was sometimes a disappointment to me. And so reading Snow White and Rose Red was really fun because it showed me that there was room for not just one female character in a story, there was room for two, and they could both be the heroine, and they could both cooperate and help each other. Their strengths complemented each other. They were never competing or in opposition. They always were in it together and stuck by each other throughout the whole tale. And I just found that really a delightful thing to see as a young girl reading stories. It was a kind of a quirky little alternative to some of the maybe not so satisfying female characters that I was seeing at the time. And that story, like I said, has just always stuck with me, and I thought it would be the perfect one to put my own spin on, because in that original tale there's so much potential there. There's so much that is maybe left unsaid or that could be expanded upon. So I really enjoyed putting my own twist and my own flavor on some of those characters.